everyone basically said that's the same thing. Christian faith would be a lie if Jesus did not rise from the dead. I was like, wow, so you have proof that Jesus rose from the dead? They're like, yeah, we have proof. I'm like, we're talking about an event of someone rising from the dead. So basically the probability of anyone to rise from dead is 0. So you believe in the Bible because Jesus rose from the dead. And you believe Jesus rose from the dead because Bible is true. So it's a circular argument. Then I actually started to talk about with Mark and Simon. Again, Simon is an Anabaptist and Mark is evangelical Christian. So I had met them; they were my friends. So I started mainly to talk to them about this. One of the things I saw specifically with Simon, his belief seemed to be a bit more different than the mainstream Christian beliefs of evangelical beliefs. For example, the original sin, for example, believing that kids are born with sinners and something like that. And other aspects, like what Jesus said is the one thing that actually matters the most than anything else. So those, of course, resonated more with me. And I actually was like, okay, well, I think we have some common ground. We can start to talk about that. And he seemed a bit more open to talking about, very respectful, very understanding. It was great talking to him. He's a great friend. With them, I first actually read a book. It is written by an Anabaptist. It's called The Kingdom That Changed the World Upside Down. It was really about how the mainstream Christianity is actually perhaps not what really the message of Christianity is, and it really talks about Anabaptist beliefs. Again, so that was the first book I read with Simon and Mark. There were some questions that I had about mainstream Christianity that actually got answered because of that book. A lot of the concept of that book was about pacifism and really taking the words of Jesus literally, in that fact that the Sermon on the Mount particularly is that what he said he really meant. So that was really interesting, very sincere and very caring and empathetic, and really following the role model of Jesus in that. So again, that resonated very well with me. At the end of the day, even if you read that book that I just talked about, The Kingdom That Turned the World Upside Down, even that book would say, okay, you know what? Believing in Jesus as God and the fact that he died for our sins and resurrected, those are still core beliefs, core theology. We still need to believe that before we go into all these other aspects. So even on those aspects, there would not be any difference. So that's where we started to discuss more. So the main things that we discussed was about the aspect of Jesus being God, and did he die and rise from the dead? And is a blood sacrifice needed? And did he have to pay for the sins of humanity? We read a book of Nabil Qureshi. He was a Muslim, I believe a certain sect of Islam that is not the mainstream Islam. So he converted from that to Christianity. His main conversion was because of his conversation with David Wood. So his book that we read is called Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. And it was his story about how he grew up as a Muslim and then he converted to Christianity. So we read that. I thought the book was really well written. It really goes through his life and what he was feeling and how he went through this whole journey. I don't agree with a lot of things that he talks about, like that's at least the logical aspects of things, but I can still see and understand why he converted. Just because I can understand that doesn't mean I agree with, of course, a lot of things that he said. Eventually what he came down to was like, okay, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then the whole Christian faith is not really acceptable. So that's a lie. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. So you're saying Christianity is true because Jesus rose from the dead? And of course I talked about that. They were like, yeah. And I should say that there were other conversations, not just with Mark and Simon. There were other conversations that happened with Justin and Brian and many other people about this. And everyone basically said that's the same thing. Yes, Christian faith would be a lie if Jesus did not rise from the dead. I was like, wow. So how do you prove that? So you have proof that Jesus rose from the dead? They're like, yeah, we have proof. I'm like, we're talking about an event of someone rising from the dead. No one in the history of the world that we know of has ever risen from dead. So basically the probability of anyone to rise from dead is 0. And They're like, yeah, but just because the probability is 0 does not mean that he did not rise from the dead. Okay, what's the evidence? Because of that, we also started to look into other books, and one of the main books we looked into was by Mike Licona. He actually, I think, did his PhD thesis on this, also on this topic, proving that resurrection actually happened, and there's proof of that. The book itself, the earlier chapters of this book, I would say they are great. I read other books by Christian authors as well, and even the debates, and I must state that usually the setup of the problem and setup of the situation is done really, really well. What my issues usually come is always after when the arguments are brought up. But anyways, so they were like, okay, well, Mike Licona has a full research book on this, and it states that we can prove for a fact that Jesus' resurrection is a historical fact. I'm like, how can you prove that? It's a historical fact. The main thing is that there were 500 people who saw Jesus alive after he was dead. They saw him. I'm like, wait, where does it say that? So it's like, okay, there's one place in the Bible, Paul wrote that there are 500 people among you that have seen Jesus after he rose from the dead. And I was like, okay, well, that's just one place where it states that, first of all. Second, who are these 500 people? There's no name, there's nothing, no evidence, anything about who are these people. And to state that this is the reason, and someone wrote that there were 500 people who saw it, I'm like, that's a very, very strong belief in someone who wrote about another set of people who we don't know anything about, that they saw Jesus after he rose from the dead. And that should be our belief. I was talking to Mark about this, and Mark and Simon both. Mark said, okay, well, think about it. You're sitting right now, and let's just say 100 people came outside, and they were like, Ali, something got destroyed, whatever. I don't remember what he actually said, but it's like, okay, some crazy event happened. 100 people came in, told you that. I'm like, well, I would be intrigued, and I'll be like, oh, really? I should go look at it. But I would actually go look at it. It's like, okay, did it actually happen before I even believe this? He's like, okay, well, what if it could be 500 or 1,000 people? I'm like, yeah, but I would still not just believe it just because 100 people or 500 people came and told me this. And secondly, in this case, they're not telling me. There are no 500 people coming and telling me that. There is actually one person who's telling me that there are 500 people who saw Jesus. To me, that was quite interesting, that this is what proves that it's a historical fact. And by the way, all the letters were written, let's just say, even in the earliest case, was a decade after. So this is a decade after the actual phenomena of death and resurrection. So a lot of things can change in that, and a lot of stories can be built in that. What I wanted to search was that, okay, have there ever been cases in modern history where people saw someone rise from the dead? And actually, there are a lot of hallucinations. So they're like, okay, well, hallucinations, while they are true, it doesn't apply if there are 500 people. And I believe Nabil's book also wrote about this. I think he went and talked to some psychologists, and they told him that, yeah, it's that's not really the case where 500 people just can have hallucination about the same thing at the same time. And I'm like, okay, well, sure, I get that, but let's look at it. Let's look at the fact that have there been people who've seen one particular figure rise from the dead, and a lot of people saw it. Actually, there are a lot of examples of that. I can point to one of them, and I can put that in the reference. It's just a website I found where it's a news article, I believe, where it says that in Portugal, it says hundreds of people, many, many people saw Mary, mother of Jesus, come down, and they were able to go talk to her, and they were able to touch her. So there is talk about people touching Jesus when he rose from the dead. There were people who said, yeah, they were able to touch Mother Mary in that particular encounter. And I'm like, okay, would you believe this? Do you think that actually happened? And if I ask Protestant Christians today, what would they say? What would they say that did it actually happen? And how would you say that this works with the event we're talking about Jesus' resurrection? And is that trustworthy? Can I just trust 500 people who just told me that they saw Mary? Not only they had a conversation with her, they were able to touch her, they were able to do that. Probably not. I would state that Simon actually said, I think it's probably a demonic thing that happened. Okay, I still respect that, because I'm like, okay, well, sure. I guess that could happen. Of course, there's no way for me to tell if that was demonic or what was happening at Jesus' time was demonic or anything. Anyways, but we cannot state that this is the proof that we're going to build our faith on completely, where we cannot even prove this particular fact. There were one strong thing that I've heard people talk about, and Simon and Mark also brought it up, is like, and Nabil also brought it up in his book, was that, well, apostles died for their beliefs. So they believe Jesus rose from the dead. Why would they die for something they didn't actually believe in? And I'm like, okay, first, again, I did my search on it, and actually there have been a lot of cases where there have been false prophets who died claiming they were false prophets, and they actually died on that. And I'm like, why would those people die? And on that case, both Christian and Muslim would agree that they were actually false prophets. Were they lying or not? There is evidence of people who believed, who actually died for something they potentially did not believe, or maybe they did believe that, and they died believing this, which was potentially a lie. So for me, it was like, okay, that's one. Second, the death of a lot of apostles is not really talked about. We don't know what or how they died, most of them. So that's another argument about this. And the final one, which to me is another important thing to discuss, is that we don't know what they died for. They died for being Christian, and even the ones that we talk about who were martyred, they were martyred because of being Christian. We could say that, okay, well, that entails they believed also in the resurrection of Jesus. Yes, but they didn't die specifically for only one belief. There were a lot of different things they actually believed in, not just this particular thing. And I don't know if they were given a choice as like, okay, yeah, you can believe in all these other things, but you can't believe in Jesus actually rose from the dead. And you can live because of that. So I don't know if that would have happened or what exactly happened in that. But I'm saying that just because that happened, it doesn't really prove that Jesus rose from the dead. And that again is a pretty weak argument. There is, okay, well, there were some people who believed it and they died for that, which means it must be true. Okay. Then of course there was William Craig. He's also an apologist, Christian apologist. He actually did a whole probability theory about this and talked about the fact that, okay, probabilistically they can prove that somehow Jesus rose from the dead. And I'm like, again, I know probability. I have worked with it. I have done my PhD in robotics and AI, so we use a lot of that. So I could say that, yeah, that probability theory was not right. That was wrong. Okay, as simple as that. And if we are talking about probabilities, the probability of an event that has never happened in the history of the world, the probability of that is 0, which is basically a definition of a miracle. Now you could say, well, why would you believe in other miracles, like for example in Islam? Yeah, I would believe them, but let me just clarify this. I don't believe in Islam because I believe in the miracles, because I don't have any evidence for miracles. I believe in the miracles because I believe in Islam. It's like, okay, I believe in God, I believe in this religion specifically, and I'm like, okay, that's why I can state that, yeah, God has the ability to do impossible things, and I believe he was able to do it, and he did it. But to state that I actually believe in God and in Jesus and in Christianity because of this miracle, that's the other way around. And for me, I was like, to prove this miracle, it's impossible. How can you prove an event that has a probability of 0? So I should come back to Mike Licona. So I looked into his debate. So we were having the discussion, Mark and Simon. And after the verse, I went and looked at his debate with Bart Ehrman, in which Mike Licona said that he could prove that Jesus rose from the dead. And Bart Ehrman brought many other examples in other mythologies, and that there were situations like this where people rose from the dead and they were sons of God and all that. Mike Licona said, okay, well, we have a book, the Bible, and we can't really compare it to those religions. Well, Bart Ehrman was like, well, I thought you said your argument was actually not just based on the Bible. You could actually prove it without even the Bible, outside evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. And that was actually the end of the argument. I should say that there were other people I was talking about this, and they also raised this argument that actually there is talk about the resurrection of Jesus outside of the Bible. I was like, okay, let's look at that. I did look into it. There is talk about it. There is, I believe, some historian who talks about that. What it states is this, that there are people, I'm paraphrasing, that they're a follower of Jesus, and they believe that Jesus rose from the dead. So It doesn't state that Jesus rose from the dead. There is no evidence supporting that. It simply said that there are people who believe that Jesus rose from the dead. That's it. That's all it says. Today, if I write, okay, there are people who believe that, I don't know, that gravity is upside down now, or something like that. That for 1 second or 1 minute, the gravity was fully upside down, and there are people who believe that. Would that make it a reality after 100 years, or 1,000 years, or 2,000 years, or 3,000 years? Would that prove that, okay, there was actually gravity that was upside down? No. So that's really not evidence outside of the Bible. I should say that there is talk about that. There is some historians who have written that there was Jesus who was killed. There is written evidence of the fact that Jesus was killed by the Romans. That is written outside of the Bible. But the fact of the resurrection is not outside of the Bible. Nowhere. And it actually surprised me. I was like, okay, why did Nabil not look into that? And the way it was presented, it felt like a little bit more as if a Christian apologist talking to me and not someone who was actually searching. But anyways, I was just surprised that this was something that people built their faith in. And why was it so strongly believed like that? I was surprised by that. For this particular thing, I should also state that for all the other aspects, even about believing Jesus is God or the fact that he paid for sins of humanity, for many of the other things, people would come and say at the end, like, okay, well, you have to take a leap of faith. Interestingly, no one ever said that you have to take a leap of faith for the resurrection. I was very surprised by that. I believe actually the only person who said that was Simon at the end. That he's like, okay, well, there is some leap of faith we have to take, and we have to believe the Bible to actually believe the resurrection. He was the only person who said that to me. There was no other person who ever said that, okay, you have to take a leap of faith to believe this. And based on all this discussion, and of course all these discussions happened with multiple people, there was not one situation where I could get to the point as like, okay, well, yeah, there is proof that Jesus rose from the dead. So in conclusion about this particular part, I simply found that, okay, there's no evidence, and I think that's a closed matter. For me, yes, if someone wants to believe in the resurrection because they believe in Christianity or the Bible, sure, as a miracle, sure. But to build the other way around is not the way. But the interesting bit, in a lot of conversations, this happened. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, Christian faith would lie. So a lot of people would say that. So, of course, after a lot of conversations about the Bible or Jesus being God or anything like that, this would come out to be like a very strong thing. It's like, okay, well, we can trust this because we can know that Jesus rose from the dead. And then when you get to the part, it's like, okay, well, how do you know Jesus rose from the dead? Most of the arguments are from the Bible. So you believe in the Bible because Jesus rose from the dead. And you believe Jesus rose from the dead because the Bible is true. So it's a circular argument. And this happened a lot, actually. There was a lot of circular arguments. And this happened for other things also. Like a lot of arguments which we started with the fact, okay, well, how do we know Jesus actually was God? And they were like, well, Jesus said he would rise from the dead. And he rose from the dead. So that means he is God. And I'm like, well, first, we don't have proof that Jesus actually rose from the dead. But let's just say he did rise from the dead. Does not prove he's God. Well, they were like, okay, well, why not? I'm like, okay, well, we know that God has power to do anything. Okay, so God can raise anyone from the dead. Okay, so that God could raise Jesus, even as a human. That does not prove he's God. Well, like, okay, well, why would God raise someone who was a liar or something like that? So I was like, again, anyways, it just comes down to this circular argument. So this was kind of one thing I was very surprised by, the people who did it. And this happened for other things also.